All right, welcome back, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me once again. And I have another wonderful PA that I'd love to introduce you to. His name is Vic, and I'm actually going to let him do his introduction because he has a very unique patient population that he works with and uses telemedicine in. Hi, Vic. Welcome. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great. Hi, everybody. My name is Vic Holmes, and I've been a PA for a little over 25 years. And I had actually started my journey as a PA in the Air Force. And I worked family medicine, flight medicine, occupational medicine, dermatology. Yeah, that's pretty much. And then when I retired, I picked up with family medicine primarily. And then I took that and specialized in providing home care for the mentally and physically challenged patients that are in both Tarrant and Denton counties. And that actually came about because I would see them in clinic, and each week we would have issues where some of the patients have difficulties with autism or with severe IDD, and they would get into that crowded environment of the waiting room, and the environment would set them off, and it would just kind of feed into a death spiral where ultimately the police would need to be called and the patient would need to be taken out because they were just too unruly. And when that happened multiple times, I just said, why can't I just go and see them where they are? Because they're not like this there. They don't have those extra stimuli. And my leadership at the time said, well, let's give it a shot. If it doesn't work out, then we can always try to find something different. But they were on the verge of discontinuing seeing those patients for that very reason. So I was glad to be able to have the opportunity to go out to see them in their homes and see their families and see the environments where they actually get the care.
That's amazing. And so, give us a little bit of a time frame. When was this happening? Was this kind of like
Mm.
pre-pandemic, post-pandemic, just so we're kind of gauge when we introduced telemedicine into this?
Yeah, because telemedicine seems like it's brand new, but this was way back. So I first started doing this in 2012. So what, more than a decade ago. And at the time, all we had were tools like FaceTime. Teams wasn't really a thing. You could really connect on that, but we used FaceTime primarily. And the best experiences that I've had were pre-COVID, actually, because with telemedicine, I had to pioneer a lot of things that people just didn't know how to do. When I was providing care in the homes, I go to the homes, the group facilities to see the patients, and then I would communicate back with my preceptors using FaceTime. But that also allowed me to show them the patient live so that they could see what was actually happening. So if I had an admission that needed to be done or some issue that needed to be resolved, they could directly see what was happening there. Uh, so part of that is I live in Plano and I work in Fort Worth. So that's a bit of a commute. It's about an hour-ish or so. And the patients that I was seeing were across Tarrant County. So they were kind of scattered everywhere and in the northern end of Denton counties. So it was a bit of a drive to go and see any of these folks. So being able to practice remotely was really helpful. And one of the tools that we used when I was doing this, they came out with these remote stethoscopes. It used to be that it would be a stethoscope that would just record and then you could just play it back there. But then it eventually evolved into a stethoscope where you could record it and then send the file to some place. And so I bought a bunch of those and I showed the nurses how to use those in the different group homes. And that was a game changer because that plus the other remote tools that we had, when they had an acute problem that needed to be seen right then and there, rather than going to the emergency room or the acute care center, they could call me and say, hey, this is what I've got. And I could see where they were placing the stethoscope and then listen to the sounds that were coming out of it. I could see where they were palpating. I could see what was actually happening so that we could get a treatment plan going. And if I need to grab the keys and get in the car, they're actually doing something while I'm on the way. And there were even times where, okay, we got this going. And then in the car on the way, they would call back and say, hey, okay, now this is what's happening. This is what's happening. And then ultimately, when I arrived, would do whatever the treatment needed. But being able to do that remotely started with just an idea of, hey, what if we just decided to see them where they are?
Yeah, that's absolutely amazing. I love that you were so, I was going to say innovative because at that time it wasn't as mainstream as telemedicine is now, but you saw a need and found
You
a
didn't get
unique
paid for
way.
it back then either. I'll say that.
Yeah, the
Yeah, the
reimbursements, I'm sure, were not.
no,
The payment parity probably wasn't there
absolutely.
yet.
Right. There were a lot of things that have been put in place since then. Thank goodness for COVID for that reason. COVID bad, but this good. So
Exactly.
there is that. But being able to use those tools back then, it took a little work, but we made it work.
That's
I think we made
amazing.
a difference too.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I wanted to kind of highlight something because I think oftentimes, or what the feedback I hear when people come and chat with me about telemedicine is that certain patient populations perhaps would not be a good fit. And I think it's
Mm.
so unique that you were able to find a patient population that perhaps maybe, sometimes people assume that, but you know what happens when we assume, right? One should never assume and you can find a way to truly meet your patient where they're at. And so I'd love to hear just a little bit more about specifically that patient population, their needs, and how were they
Mm.
receptive? How did that work as far as telemedicine went?
I had 100% receptive rate. When we started that program, there was some skepticism. There were a couple of issues that we needed to work out. For example, FaceTime wasn't, is this HIPAA secure? Is it not HIPAA secure? But it's just as well as if I were making a phone call back to the preceptor. We That seemed to work out well, and at the time, everything seemed to play well in terms of the patients. So with intellectually disabled patients, they tend to have a variety of different reasons for that intellectual disability. Severe autism, IDD, they have difficulty being in crowded environments. And our waiting room was nothing but a crowded environment. And in that waiting room, you had all kinds of stimuli. And the more stimuli you have, the more those patients become anxious or annoyed or irritated by what's happening around them. They don't know what to do with that extra stimuli. So as a result, they can become combative. They can be unruly. They just don't behave like you would expect a patient to behave just because they are intellectually disabled. That's kind of the point. With the physically challenged folks, they're just physically challenged. They can't get to. They may not have an intellectual disability, but they do have a physical disability, and that physical disability prevents them from getting in the car and coming to get care more often. For example, a patient that I had that was paralyzed from the neck down. They were unable to go anywhere or do anything without the assistance of their caregivers, and their caregivers were their parents who were particularly old in their 80s. So it was very difficult for that person to actually get care. Other folks who are homebound patients tend to be homebound. So that means they're less likely to be able to get up and get care. And as a result, the problems that they have get magnified. So when you have someone who can't get care because they're intellectually disabled, because they're physically disabled, they can't get care on a routine basis, which means that the problem compounds and builds until ultimately they wind up going to the emergency room because the issue has become so great.
Yeah, absolutely. So it sounds like it almost allowed for us to have almost equitable care and kind of, level the playing field and truly meet our patients where they're at,
Oh,
um,
it does.
from
Yeah.
all walks of life that they may come from. So, actually, two questions here for you. I'll ask two questions. One is, what do you like about telemedicine, and what do you find challenging? And then the last one is going to be if you could share a message or a clinical pearl of wisdom for our PAs or PA students who may be watching, what would that be?
Sure. Well, the thing I like about telehealth you can get care faster to the individual. You can also get them care when they need it, where they need it, versus the problems building to the point where they have to go to the urgent care or the emergency room. So providing that care faster, it also helps with their home situation. So they may have caregivers who, if the patient has to go somewhere, then the caregiver has to pack them up in the vehicle, take them to the care, then bring them back. Finding parking is not always easy. So it's very difficult sometimes for them to receive care. And it's much easier with a telehealth perspective to provide the care right where they are. Also, with reimbursements now, you actually can get reimbursed almost exactly the same as in the clinic. In fact, it's a shade bit more. The biggest issue that I found with the practice that I did, because I had to show everybody how to do everything. So, and nurses are trained; they know how to do exams. That's not the issue. But the home caregivers, those caregivers themselves, or even in some cases the nurses themselves, showing them how to use the remote equipment and then so that it sends me the results. That was the biggest barrier that I really faced. My administration folks, actually, they loved it. Once we realized that the reimbursement was equitable as being in clinic, and that I was actually taking the patients inside the clinical environment, out of that clinical environment, and still able to provide care for them, my administration really enjoyed it. And I will also say too, insurance companies insurance companies have a list of people that are either bedbound or homebound, and they actually do reimburse. They'll pay an additional fee for someone to go to the home and see those folks. That was something that we discovered in 2017. It was Aetna first sent us their list. So once other people saw that what we could do was viable, they would send us lists of patients and say, hey, can you see any of these people, work these folks into your day, so that, and they would reimburse us additional just from the insurance company, because it keeps the patient from having to go to the emergency room or go to acute care. So the challenges that we had were really offset by the great benefit that was not only to the patient, but also to the caregivers and to the other staff. And if I were to give anybody a piece of advice from a PA's perspective, I would say you can do it. If you think you can do it, you can do it. When I first started doing home care, one of the most common problems was going to someone with a new idea only to be told that it can't work. But if you turn that around and say, well, how can we make this work? We were able to actually make a pretty significant difference. And I think that's the piece of advice that I would give, is that if you think you can do it, you can. And by framing it in that manner, how can we make this work? That really goes a long way towards stepping into that new role and being able to provide better care.
I love it. Thank you so much, Vic. Thank you for sharing all of
Sure.
your wisdom, your stories, your how you care for such unique patient populations. And like you said, if you think you can do it, you can. And that's, kind of pretty much just finding a way to make it work. So I love that.
Yeah,
Thank you so much. And thanks
sure.
everyone for joining and watching today. And we'll come back with another episode soon. Take care.
Thanks for
Bye.
having me. See ya.